Yeah, hi everyone. Afternoon. I don't think I've met anybody. I'm looking at the attendee list. So nice to meet you all. I'm Phil. I've been with Yellowday for about 9 months or so now. Um, do a lot of the training around difficult conversations, presentation skills, leadership development, and managing change. My background's in education. I was a secondary school teacher for a number of years, including a majority of those years in senior leadership. Did a lot of development work with colleagues, both new into the profession, but also experienced teachers and leaders. And the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I've been working within the world of sort of business outside of education, but also supporting charities, to work with the military and so on. So quite a varied kind of background. Um, if you haven't already, if you could mute your mics, but I do want you to unmute and join in because it will get a little bit monotonous if you're listening to me for the next 40 minutes. So I will be asking you to jump in and share your ideas. There will be a bit of group activity as well later on, just to give you a heads up. Okay. Let me just share my screen and then we will get going. Okay, so if this was a sort of a 3 hour session or so, what we'll be doing then is ideally covering these three objectives. So we'd be starting off to think about our attitudes and preferences towards conflict, because in terms of difficult conversations, a lot of the time that's going to be surrounding concerns around conflict. We would have a look at some techniques to use and behaviors to consider when undertaking difficult conversations. And then towards the end of that session, we would then be looking at how effective we think these skills and strategies might be and how relevant they might be to us. So to get us going, always good to start with a quote. So this is from Laura Berger, who is an executive coach. Running from conflict will not serve anyone well. Ultimately, the elephant in the room only grows or becomes much more unwieldy. Okay, which I'm sure, as pretty much the majority of you are all HR professionals, will very much appreciate that. So I did warn you, so I'm going to throw it straight over to you guys. Have a think then, in what situations in the workplace might lead to difficult conversations, and do please just unmute and share your ideas. I'm not going to pick on people at this stage. However, if nobody shares anything, then Isabel and Emily, I will be looking at the two of you to take the lead if needs be. So what kind of situations in the workplace might lead to difficult conversations?
Poor performance.
Yep, so absolutely performance matters, poor performance and performance matters. Thank you.
Personality clashes.
Yeah.
Workload, if there's a team member that's absent for whatever reason, sick or what have you.
Okay, yep. So covering for absent colleagues, long-term absences, colleagues having to share the workload, manage the workload.
When opinions differ, when somebody doesn't agree or understand, they're not on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so differences of opinion, agreeing, understanding, certainly. Any thoughts on financial matters or holidays, absences, those sorts of things?
Maybe if someone's going through something in their personal life as well.
Yeah, okay. So concerns around their personal life. In what sense, Emily, though?
So maybe if they're going through a difficult situation at home, and that might be impacting, maybe they're late for work or needed to take some time off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in terms of maybe their performance or their attendance or engagement with work and with the team members, that sort of thing, due to factors, yeah, external to them. Okay, cool. Thank you. So here's some that I came up with earlier in true Blue Peter fashion. So managing conflict within the team, financial decisions. Okay, so concerns over pay and promotion, for example. Having to deliver bad news, which I'm sure many, if not all of us on this call have been in that situation. So concerns around maybe redundancy, reductions in hours, that sort of thing. Dealing with visitors on site, if it's a for example, like a distribution depot, and there's kind of obviously health and safety requirements and regulations and so on, making sure the visitors do follow those can potentially be a tricky environment. Performance matters, we mentioned. Turning down requests, so requests for things like holidays. Quite often organizations operate a sort of first come first served procedure, which can lead to a bit of a scrabble in terms of getting in your requests before anybody else does, and then that might cause problems down the line. requests for training, changes to rotas, that sort of thing. Dealing with external agencies or dealing with external suppliers and service providers, be that in a kind of one-off situation, but also if we've got long-term contracts and agreements in place with others. And then managing your manager. Nobody mentioned this, but managing upwards and managing your manager. Okay, so these are all sort of quite common scenarios that may then lead to difficult conversations in the workplace. And without asking a very straightforward question, but I'm going to anyway, why is there a need to handle these conversations sensitively? What do we need to be aware of if we don't?
Creating more conflict.
Yeah, creating more conflict. Okay, so not addressing any concerns and it just escalates. Yeah.
So being in HR, just understanding people's preferred way of working and making sure that they understand their processes. We do find that some people have, as I say, they have a preferred way of working, but don't always understand the processes that they need to follow.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Carly. Yeah. And maybe how their preferred way of working doesn't fit in with those processes, but there's obviously a operational and business need for those processes to be followed. Yeah. Laura, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say to avoid a breakdown in the relationship.
Yeah, so absolutely, yeah, to be aware of potential breakdowns in relationship by not addressing these concerns. Absolutely. Okay. Any more? Okay, so again, here's some I prepared earlier. So if we don't tackle some of these issues, for example, and don't address or don't meet the requirement for that difficult conversation, it can send a message that we tolerate and permit poor performance. If we're a team leader, for example, and we're not supporting the rest of the team by addressing any concerns with an individual, that can send a message that we tolerate and permit poor performance from our team. That can then have an impact in terms of team harmony and balance, because other team members may well get feel disgruntled or feel like that they're not being supported because others are being ignored and not being challenged. It can potentially lead to GBH in the sense of grievance, bullying, and harassment. If there's concerns of that nature within the team, can lead to something that we call conflict creep, where it effectively sets the mess or sends the message and sets the tone that we permit and allow a certain level of conflict within the team. And if we don't address that, then that becomes the norm. And then the next time, then it can escalate from there and so on and so forth. So we get this creeping effect of where conflict becomes part and parcel maybe of how the team operates or how the organization operates. For you as a leader, it can erode support for you because if you're not being seen to be tackling poor performance or tackling any concerns with your team or individuals, not just your team, but also your peers and colleagues may well be looking at you with regards to how well you're leading and managing that team. You'll know as HR professionals that can have a massive impact in terms of retention and recruitment. There's that old saying, isn't it, that people join organizations and leave managers. And if there is an undercurrent of concern over people shying away from difficult conversations and shying away from conflict, that can have an impact on retention. And then if that then becomes a pattern and potential employees are aware of that, that can also lead to concerns over recruitment and the quality of people that we may end up recruiting. Worst case scenario then is that it can escalate and we can get ourselves into situations with regarding constructive dismissals, employment tribunals, and so on. Okay. And then finally, it can also erode and impact the public profile of the organization. So members of the public, be those friends, be those colleagues, etc., may well become aware of how the organization is operating and dealing with conflict. And avoiding difficult conversations, which can then obviously have that concern in terms of public profile. So before we start to look at how we might approach conflict in ourselves, I just want to kind of briefly consider constructive and destructive conflict. I like conflict. I'm quite a challenging person at times in the workplace, and I quite like to push buttons and to ask questions and to probe because I find it can be quite beneficial. Anybody want to suggest how we might view conflict as constructive?
I think it could be constructive if it's done in a proactive and respectful way. So the word conflict is quite emotive, isn't it? But it doesn't necessarily mean an unpleasant confrontation. So if you're conflicting against somebody else's idea and views, as long as it's handled, if you're in an environment where you have a right to your view as well, but you're respectful of the other person's view, I think that's probably where it goes wrong, doesn't it?
And I think that's a really good point, Jane, that we can certainly see the need to be respectful, the need to be mindful of each other's, and use that difference of opinion in a positive way. Yeah.
I think it's understanding the steps that need to be taken.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. In what sense, Carla? We will come on to this later on, but at this
Well,
point,
depending on the situation, I think it needs to be broken down into bite-sized pieces. So if it was somebody that was there was conflict with regards to them not following procedures or anything along those lines, then it needs to be broken down, and we would go through it with them to say these are the steps that need to be followed, because quite often people miss steps out of the process, which does cause conflict with third parties.
okay. And I guess in breaking it down and understanding, breaking it down in terms of sequential steps, it may well give us then a bit of understanding and insight into why people in this example aren't following procedure as we'd expect, or aren't doing what's required of them.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So here's some ideas I've come up with in terms of constructive conflict. So disagreement and therefore conflict leads to new ideas. Okay, we've all, I'm sure, been in meetings where we've been planning things and bouncing ideas around, and there's nothing. Well, there probably is, but it can be quite uninspiring to leave one of those meetings where no one says anything and we just go with what the person has presented. Okay, whereas actually, if we feel strongly about it and we challenge in a polite and respectful way, that can lead to new ideas. I can see a few smiles on the screen as I'm saying that. Conflict accelerates change because conflict highlights that there is an issue. Okay, if there wasn't the conflict, there wouldn't necessarily be a concern. But if we've got conflict present in the workplace or present with between team members and so on, it highlights there's an issue, which can then pose the question of, well, why is there an issue, and can we do anything about it, which can then be a source of accelerating change. It can also realign everybody on objectives. So going back to our meeting, maybe where we're having a bit of a session where we're trying to work out how to solve a problem in the workplace. And rather than my first example where one solution is presented and nobody has an opinion, okay, maybe in a different scenario, one solution is presented and then everybody has an alternative opinion. Okay. The strong manager there, or the strong chair of that meeting, may well need to bring everybody back into focus and in online rather than going off on tangents and so on. So conflict can realign everybody on the objectives. Okay, I've mentioned already with regards to accelerating change, it can identify underlying problems and issues. And conflict's also a very good way of re-establishing, or more establishing in the first place, team identity. Okay, I often use an example here from sport. So if we imagine, a football or a rugby team, and they're going through a poor run of performances and a poor run of results, okay, and the managers may be losing the trust in the players and the dressing room is moving away from them. In that situation where there's internal conflict within the team, a good way out of that is to kind of re-establish who we are, who we're playing for, the badge, the team, the pride, the history, all that kind of thing. So I'm going to suggest that we shouldn't always see conflict as a negative thing. Okay, because it can be something which it very much brings about positives as a consequence. Does anybody want to jump in at this point before we have a look at how these things can lead to destructive situations?
Do you know what, Phil? I think that's really interesting. I'd never thought about it that way before. And I think I'm struggling a little bit with this word conflict, because I probably wouldn't use that word. I would probably use like a constructive challenge.
Yeah.
But seeing that constructive conflict, for me, I might make myself sound a little bit sillier, but that feels like a bit of a light bulb moment, actually.
Okay, good.
Because I think about like a conflict and maybe in a different way.
Yeah. That's what we're here for, Laura, which is great. And I did use the word conflict deliberately, so it is an emotive word, and it is something which carries with it negative connotations and so on. But actually, if we reframe how we view it, we can absolutely see how it can be beneficial.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah. No, thank you. Really good point. Thank you. Now, that said, it also can be destructive. So conflict can be an absolute waste of time and resource. Okay, because if as HR managers and professionals or as team leaders and so on, if we're constantly running around, banging heads together in a, inverted commas way, it's draining, yeah, and it's a waste of time and so on. It can threaten our well-being. Okay, if the workplace is a concern or if the team is a concern, it can lead to concerns with regards to mental health and well-being, which can then have an impact in terms of physical health and well-being as well, obviously lead to absences, etc. Not addressing conflict and going back to that the last but one slide about conflict creep, it can create a toxic environment. Okay, it can potentially promote hostility and aggression in the workplace, and it can fundamentally challenge and break down team cohesion. So it's important, I think, to not shy away from conflict. And I think, Carly, you said this right at the start of this bit. As long as it's done in an appropriate and constructive way, rather than in a aggressive and negative, maybe sort of directed towards an individual way. And if this was the full course, we would absolutely be doing some work on active listening and also about how we prepare ourselves for these difficult conversations in order to maybe not go into them in an emotive way or a het up way. Okay. This is, for me, this is quite a good way of representing it in a pictorial form. So on the left, we've got unproductive conflict. We've got two individuals pulling at either end of a big massive string. Okay, and that's not going to get us anywhere. Depending on who pulls the hardest or who pulls the longest will depend upon how that string potentially unravels. Whereas on the right, we've still got a big bundle of mess and massive string, but both individuals are pulling in the same direction. Okay, so we have the problem, we have the conflict in inverted commas, or the issue, but what we're doing here then is working together and cooperating in order to solve it. And that's that idea about it generates new ideas. It also accelerates change and so on. So we're going to do a short little exercise. Now, if this was the full session, what I would have done is to send you a diagnostic to complete in advance. And this is like with all diagnostics, I always kind of add the caveat that they're not labeling you as something permanently. They can vary and they can change in terms of situations, context, also how we change our approaches and so on over time. But there is a diagnostic that I would use at this point, and it would basically highlight different ways of approaching conflict, which will be one of these 4 or 5 things. Okay, so on this graph, what we've got then is essentially 4 different ways of approaching conflict with compromise in the middle. On the bottom, we've got the extent to which we want to cooperate with others. Okay, so from being uncooperative on the left-hand side all the way through to cooperative on the right. And then on the vertical axis, what we've got is how assertive we are with regards to attempting to satisfy or share our own concerns, with the least assertive on the left, on the bottom left, moving up then to the most assertive top left. Okay, so what this diagnostic, what it would do is essentially ask you a series of 30 or so questions. You'd plot the answers into a graph, and it would come up with different values for these things. Okay. Obviously, we're not going to do that, but we can still talk through the results, and it might help you to maybe think about yourselves in this example, or maybe a colleague, or maybe a member of the team as well. Okay, so I was going to say that none of these are in particular bad, but actually that's not true, because the bottom left one is the one we do generally want to avoid being. So the avoiding one then is where we're not willing to cooperate with others, okay, and equally we're not being assertive to ourselves. So the goal here is to delay. So I'm sure we've all seen individuals, and potentially we've also done it ourselves, where in a difficult conversation situation or potential conflict, what we've done is just avoid it completely. Okay, we've delayed having to address it, or we've just outright not addressed it at all. Now, there are times where maybe that is the right thing to do. Okay, so for example, if someone is particularly emotive in the moment, or is particularly passionate, or it's a bit of a crisis moment, actually, rather than kind of picking up and challenging somebody on their behavior and having that difficult conversation, that might not be the best approach. However, if we tend to default towards an avoiding strategy, what we'll find then is that not only are we not looking to satisfy other people's concerns, we're also not looking after ourselves, because we're not asserting our own wants and needs in that situation. And that can have a long-term implication and effect. Okay. So moving across to the bottom right then, so the accommodating lifestyle, or the accommodating approach then, the goal is to yield. The goal is to give over or give way to the other person. Okay, so what we find in this situation is that people can become very, very cooperative towards others, but what they're not doing is necessarily focusing on and satisfying their own concerns. They're not asserting their own wants and needs. Okay, so this will be the individual who says yes to requests all the time, even though they've just said yes to a number of other requests and their workload is piling up and they're concerned about how they're going to be able to meet those requests. But actually, rather than having to say no to somebody or having to compromise, what they're looking to do then is just to accommodate that request. Okay, and then that over time can lead to frustrations in terms of promising too much but maybe not delivering, or maybe concerns over burnout and concerns over workload and that kind of thing. Okay. Now, there is a time as well, like the avoiding, that accommodating is actually the right thing to do. Because again, if we need some quick wins, maybe we need to get somebody on board and get someone engaged with our viewpoint and so on. So by accommodating their requests, etc., it can draw them to us, which kind of gets them on side. And then down the line, we know that we've got maybe a supporter and an ally for maybe potential changes moving forward. Okay. Top left then is competing. So in this situation, then we're not interested in satisfying other people's concerns, but we are very interested in asserting our own wants and needs and our own concerns and making sure that our own wants and needs are being met. Okay, so the phrase I've used there, then the goal is to win. Okay, so if we were thinking about red, yellow, green, blue leadership behaviors and colors, this is the red fiery dominant person in this box here. Okay, now if our default position is to win and to be right, the danger is that we're not always in full possession of the facts and the information, or maybe we don't have the experience or the breadth of perception and consideration to properly properly view the situation in order to come up with the best idea. But if we are asserting our own position and asserting our own authority, maybe, or our own expertise, even if it's limited, the danger is that we come up with the wrong solution or the wrong conclusion. That said, there is a time for that very assertive behavior. Okay, the fire alarm goes off. Yeah, there's an emergency in the workplace. You don't want to turn to somebody in a very accommodating way and go, would you mind if when you're ready, you could just kind of finish what you're doing and maybe, gather your things, don't leave them, gather all your things up and make your way slowly, have a little chat, maybe get a coffee and meet in the fire, in the fire muster point outside. There's a time where we need to be very assertive. There's a time, in emergency situations, crisis situations, maybe in terms of armed forces, public services, that sort of thing, where actually we need to get people to do things straight away. Okay, so there is absolutely a time and a place for that. So what we're left with then is the last two. Now, ideally, collaborating is like that gold star, that North Star that we're aiming for, because not only are we cooperating with others, what we're also doing though is looking after our own wants and needs. Okay, so we're being aware of our own requirements and asserting them, but we're also then looking to cooperate. Now that isn't always possible, so we end up potentially sliding into the middle, which is where there's an element of compromise. And there'll be an element whereby we're willing to maybe negotiate on how many of our wants and needs are met, but there are certain things we're not willing to negotiate on. And likewise, there may well be things that we're willing to give up in order to cooperate with others, but there are certain lines, maybe certain non-negotiables, that we're not willing to compromise on. Okay, so I've used this a lot with both with new leaders, new managers, new supervisors, but also again very experienced leaders and managers all the way up to sort of board level, because they may not be aware of maybe their position and situation in terms of how they approach conflict, and therefore how they go into difficult conversations. If someone is naturally maybe leaning more towards a competitive approach, when they do enter a difficult conversation, they may well not be listening to what's being said by the other person, may well not be willing to share and appreciate and maybe consider their ideas. Or on the converse, if someone is very accommodating towards others because they don't like conflict and they shy away from conflict and having difficult conversations, they can end up maybe agreeing to more than they normally would or would normally hope for, or normally what is beneficial. So this
I
is quite
think what
sorry, Carla, go on.
Sorry, I'm just thinking that on some of the situations, I've noticed that the manager appears to be active listening, showing empathy and delivering clear communication, but their body language might be saying something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is something which on the full session we would be looking at, not just what we say, but how we say it, how we hold ourselves and so on, how we even set out the room. If it's a face-to-face one-to-one meeting, for example, if we're sat one side of a desk and we invite the person to sit on the other side of the desk, that automatically creates a barrier between us and them. And it sends an implicit message that we are in charge of this situation. They are the ones being invited in, which is right, but also it can potentially lead to a negative perspective in the sense of I'm right, you're wrong, and so on. And we can do that in our body language as well. We can say the right things and we can nod and smile, etc. But actually, if our arms are crossed and we're leaning away from somebody, we're not leaning towards them and engaging with what they're saying, it sends mixed messages.
I think eye rolling is a common one that I've seen. So then obviously the employee is thinking, they're not listening to me.
Yeah.
They're not going to support me.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. So given that, as this is a very quick introduction, a very quick overview, just take a moment and unmute and share your thoughts. How might you use this awareness, or if you were, a participant on one of these courses with Yellowday, how might you expect them to use this awareness when approaching conflict and difficult conversations?
It could be on a day-to-day basis in many, many situations. So I think when they're trying to, when you're greeting somebody, when you're trying to train somebody, obviously it could be on disciplinaries, grievances. So there's many situations that you can apply it to.
Yeah. Thank you, Carla.
I think, as Laura was saying about conflict, now looking at it positively, I think that's a really good way to apply it. Make you feel like, okay, it's positive. Let's get something good out of this. So I think that's a really good one to be aware of.
Yeah. Thank you, Tina. I know in my own situation, I'm very different in the workplace compared to at home. At home, there are more often than not, I can be very accommodating, and I'll be like, yeah, whatever you want, because if I've had a long day at work, or a long sort of week at work, maybe I'm tired, and maybe I just need to just kind of like allow my partner to make decisions about mundane things like what we're having for dinner tonight or whatever. Whereas in the workplace, and when I've been in leadership positions in education and business and so on, I've maybe steered more towards, well, ideally towards that, the compromising or collaborating approach, but maybe started from a position of I need to drive things through. There's decisions that need to be made and actions that need to occur. So maybe being quite strong initially in my approach, and then bring that down to maybe more of a cooperative approach. Whereas maybe outside of work, I can be much more accommodating, knowing but also knowing where my lines are to not cross, if that makes sense. Again, I could see a few smirks there from people in terms of differences in the workplace and at home as well. Okay. Cool. So we're going to move on and just have a think about how we might approach conflict. And this is very much aimed at team leaders and supervisors rather than HR professionals, but it absolutely will be relevant. Obviously, we're all on this call aware of ACAS. So a nice little way of summarising here. Many potential disciplinary or grievance issues can be resolved informally. A quiet word is often all that is required to resolve an issue. Bearing in mind this is being recorded, I'm not going to ask you to share your horror stories, but I'm sure you can all consider horror stories where things haven't been addressed, and maybe concerns weren't nipped in the bud earlier on, or that difficult conversation wasn't had, and then things escalate and it goes from 0 to 100 very, very quickly, when actually this could have been stopped and headed off with that quiet word, or with that semi-formal procedure, without bringing in policies, processes, disciplinaries, and all that sort of thing. Okay, so if I was a team leader here, or if I was working with a team leader, maybe coaching a team leader and looking at how they wanted to do things, I'd be recommending then, first thing at first, take action quickly. And I'd be asking them to obviously establish how this started, but really to consider for future benefit, could I have intervened earlier? Okay. And then also to ask the question, what might develop if left unchecked? Because sometimes we can rush in too quickly into a situation where there's conflict, have that difficult conversation, and actually it escalates and it makes it worse. And there's a fine balance between taking action quickly and taking action too quickly. Okay, and that's something that experience will tell us, and also the individuals involved as we get to know them. Speaking of individuals, it's obviously important that we deal with individuals. We talk in private one-to-one. Okay, a lot of work where I've done mediation, for example, with organizations, quite often things have escalated because the manager or the supervisor has dealt with the individual in public, okay, rather than in private, and that's led to concerns where obviously they feel picked on, they feel victimized, and it's very much in the public environment. So talking in private, keeping it one-to-one, sticking to the observed facts, not conjecture or speculation. Okay, so classic example would be if you're a supervisor in a shift situation, in a rota situation, and you're aware from your colleagues and other members of the team that Phil is always late to work. Okay, but you've never seen Phil being late to work, and you don't have CCTV which checks at what point Phil arrives at work. If you then go steaming into that conversation with Phil and go, "I'm fed up with you being late to work. All I hear is people complaining about it," and so on. You're going to be on the back foot when you get challenged in terms of, well, when was I late? What was the evidence? You don't start at the same time as me, so how do you know that I was late for work and all that sort of thing? So let's keep it to what we see and what we know, rather than necessarily what we've heard. But depending upon the HR team, and I mean this respectfully as someone who's also worked in HR, sometimes having an HR person in there is great. At other times, it maybe heightens the situation because people start thinking, "Oh, hang on a moment, we've got HR in." And actually, in that context, what I might do is ask someone in a similar position to myself, so another team leader from another department, just to come in and sit in, so that they're of a similar experience and responsibility and level, but they're not. It's not like, "Oh, okay, HR are coming in. This is now escalated to a higher level," if that makes sense. And then the last one here: ask individuals what they're prepared to do to resolve the issue. Okay, it shouldn't be you having to solve it. It might have to be, but ideally it shouldn't be. If we can ask the people involved, well, what are you prepared to do to solve the issue? That's bringing in that notion of cooperation and collaboration that we looked at a moment ago. What we're then moving on to do is your role as the mediator. Okay, you're not there to take sides. Okay, brilliant if we can bring the two parties together to discuss matters. Okay, and that kind of follows on from that point about what are they willing to do. And I'm sure we've maybe experienced situations either with ourselves or with colleagues where we've had to get involved where there's been allegations of favoritism towards another colleague, for example, where maybe like two individuals are quite good friends. One of them is the manager or the supervisor, but they've then got to go into a situation where they are potentially having to not necessarily discipline, but certainly having to have an awkward conversation, and that can be a problem there. But you're not there to take sides. You are there to mediate and bring the two parties together, assuming it's not you that's involved. Keep a record. Again, this will depend upon your organization's policies, but doesn't necessarily have to be like a file note that gets recorded, depending on the severity of it. jumping to that last bullet point, what I absolutely would recommend is that individuals receive just an email afterwards. Thank you very much for meeting with me today. As promised, here's a record of what was discussed. That's a very neutral tone, that sentence. It's not saying you will do this and so on. It is simply a record of what's discussed. So it's there down the line if you need to. Jumping back to that first one, really important that we prepare questions we want to ask in advance, so we don't get caught on the hoof going into that situation. And the last point, which I'm sure you'll all be pleased to hear, is obviously we would recommend to seek HR if there's potential for escalation or actual escalation, because again, I'm sure we've all had situations where people haven't let HR know, where it's maybe not worked and not gone particularly well. And it's not until it lands on your desk, either maybe there's a grievance, for example, that's been raised, and you've then got to deal with it. And that might be the first you've ever heard of it. So I'd be encouraging, the team leaders and so on, that following the process and procedures and policies of the organisation, just giving people a heads up and letting them know. Okay, so this slide is something that I've often shared with as I said, both new and also existing leaders. It's not formal. It's there's no processes, there's no policies. We're not bringing in ACAS best practice in that sense. It's more a case of how would I go about managing that conflict. Okay. Final bit from me, because I'm aware of the time. Now let's imagine though that actually, unfortunately, that hasn't worked, and we are going to have to then sit down and have that difficult conversation. First thing first, what do I want to achieve? Okay. Make sure we're clear before we go in what I want to achieve. What's the best case scenario? What's the best case outcome in this? What's the worst case outcome? And am I happy to compromise? Okay, where is the line that I am not willing to cross? And where is the line of, what's above that line, which I'm willing to give away, I'm willing to cooperate on, if it's going to achieve, a solution. Ideally, we aim for the best. We avoid the worst. It may well be that we've got to compromise a little bit. Second one, and this goes back, Tina, to I think what you were saying earlier. Am I emotionally calm and reasonable given the circumstances? Okay, so some of the sort of not the worst, but certainly some situations can escalate when people go into these conversations in the heat of the moment. Okay, and incidents happen, flare-ups happened in the workplace, and the manager and the leader go straight into that conversation. They may well be then, disappointed, fired up, emotionally het up, whatever it is. Okay, that conversation is not going to go well. I've added given the circumstances, because it may well be that actually it's pretty serious, and you have a right to be, frustrated and agitated and so on. But we need to sort of moderate it, before we go in. And then the last thing to consider is, have I removed or minimized barriers to a successful conversation? Okay, what I mean by this is things like background noise in public, in private, the layout of the room. I mentioned it earlier about, two people sat opposite a desk as opposed to two people sat, at right angles side by side, or slightly, turned away, but still kind of facing each other. Start of the day, end of the day, okay, tired, all that sort of thing. Maybe you've just left, you're about to go into a big meeting. You're about to go into this conversation. You've just left a really important meeting. You're rushing from one thing to the next. You haven't taken the time or the moment to compose yourself before you go in. Okay. And then just sticking on that, that kind of like reframing how we see conflict. Let's also reframe how we see disagreement. So Ian Leslie, great book, How to Disagree. He's written a number of books. Basically, what he says, and I absolutely agree with this, and we should be aware of, most of us are really bad at disagreeing. Okay, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, and Ian Leslie draws it back to evolution. Evolution hasn't equipped us to disagree. Okay, we are social beings, we're tribal beings, and we need to cooperate and work together. So most of us are pretty bad, okay, at disagreeing. That's fine. Okay. Sorry. He also says new ideas come from purposeful disagreements. Okay, and I mentioned that right at the start in terms of constructive conflict. Okay. Looking to win or dominate an argument will not lead to progress. Okay, solutions and win-wins. Okay. Conflict gives us information. So without conflict, we don't know the other person's point of view. Okay, I'm sure we can all think about this in our personal lives and so on, but also in the workplace as well. When we aren't challenging and pushing back against other people, we don't get an opportunity to understand and realize where they're coming from and why they might disagree with us. Okay. Think about the best teams that you've ever worked in, or the best teams in your organization. Okay. Good teams disagree. Okay. The number of times I've sat in team meetings, senior level team meetings, and been, with respect to previous colleagues, quite bored because nobody's challenging and nobody's disagreeing. Okay. Good teams disagree. Diverse teams disagree. Okay. And we benefit from it, providing it's done in that constructive and polite way, and so on. And the last one, it's easy to say, not necessarily easy to do. Let go of being right. Okay. And I'm really bad at this at times. And you're probably not surprised, given what I said earlier about, where I sit on the compromise and so on situation. Let go of being right. Okay. Understand where your line is and where your limit is and your non-negotiables, but actually work together, around disagreements rather than trying to score points. Okay. That is everything from me. I will stop sharing my screen. And I'll hand over to Emily, if that's all right.
Thank you, Phil. Just to say thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your contributions throughout that. It's really helpful to hear from you with your perspectives and your questions. But thank you mostly to Phil. That was a really nice, inspiring way to spend a Tuesday afternoon.